Let me first and foremost thank IFPRI, and in particular Professor Kwajo Asenso-Okere, the Director of IFPRI's Eastern and Southern Africa Regional Office, for inviting me to share some of my thoughts on the theme of the Conference on Agricultural Productivity and Food Security. As you may have noted from the program of the conference, and as Professor Kwajo has already alluded to it, I was supposed to speak on food security in Africa, a synopsis. By now, the series of deliberations that took place over the last couple of days must have addressed nearly everything that is relevant to the topic of food security in Africa. Apparently, the only remaining session is the panel discussion on what priorities there are. In view of the fact that I am making my keynotes on the very last day of the conference and on the margins of its conclusion, you might obviously have appreciated the fact that I was put in a very difficult situation to talk about food security synopsis in Africa. I had to turn to Professor Kwajo himself to seek for his indulgence and guidance, expressing my difficulty in talking about a synopsis of food security in Africa on the very last day of the conference that has gone deep into analyzing the situation, not just talking about its synopsis. He was so kind enough as to be flexible in advising me to organize my presentation on a topic that, in my opinion, will build and complement to what may have already been adequately covered by other speakers in the previous sessions. Part of my difficulty is now overcome, for I don't have to grapple with the topic that was initially assigned to me. However, Professor Kwajo may not have noticed it, but surely he has unwittingly made my life even more difficult. For what he was suggesting is that I should bring in fresh and original items into the deliberations and be wary of not repeating what has already been said. This sounds not just challenging, but also intimidating. A quick stock-taking of the items that have already been covered indicates that issues ranging from farm resources, land, water, fertilizers, plant protection materials, advisory services, and so on, to the management of these resources at farm level and their outcomes, efficiency, profitability, to agricultural value chains, food reserves, the rural non-farm sector, nutrition, and health have been covered. The very thematic areas around which these deliberations are organized, that is technology and innovation, markets, trade and regional integration, capacities, investments, institutions, and policies, is such dense and comprehensive that it leaves almost no room for omission of any other relevant item. However, you may agree with me that nearly everything that has been covered under those topics is about issues within the confines of the agricultural and rural setting. Improving uptake of technology by farmers, improving availability and use of farm inputs by farmers, enhancing the performance of agricultural markets, increasing agricultural investments, enhancing agricultural policies and strategies, and so on. No doubt, these are the direct relevant issues to boost agricultural productivity and improve food security. We can take a farmer or a farming community, an agricultural commodity, or even the broader agricultural sector itself. Agricultural productivity can be increased through getting all the ingredients right, the inputs, the technology, and the formula of their mix right. In fact, this has been done over and over again, though at a limited scale, in demonstration plots, in piloting sites, and even in selected regions, where a number of the sorts are conducted in controlled environments. The challenge has been and remains to be how to make this happen on a sufficiently broader and sustainable scale, Most of the factors that condition agricultural productivity cannot thus be controlled in the African realities. That's why we need to peel off yet another layer in search of the conditions that make all this work on a sufficiently broader scale and sustainable basis. I believe that not all solutions to problems of agricultural productivity and food security are to be found by dwelling exclusively on the agricultural and rural sector itself. In fact, one realizes that many of the factors affecting agricultural productivity are not to be found within the agricultural and rural sector per se. We definitely cannot promote agricultural research and development or improve agricultural factor in product markets on a sustainable basis without looking at what happens beyond demonstration plots and beyond the agricultural and the rural sector. Hence, I wish to add one more perspective to the layer of deliberations by way of focusing on processes and structures that make the very conditions upon which those issues are situated. I will attempt to do this through locating the realm of search for those fresh items beyond agricultural and beyond the rural sector itself, fresh quote unquote, which I believe are relevant and instrumental towards enhancing food security through increased agricultural productivity in Africa. I call this venture an attempt towards interrogating the bigger picture. In view of the fact that the next immediate session is on state of priorities, it's my hope that such a perspective will also inform the deliberations. That's why you see the title that I gave to myself. So I wouldn't intend to take your precious time by talking about how low agricultural productivity is in Africa and how this has been exacerbating the status of Africa's food insecurity. I sincerely hope that you will bear with me if I, however, come back to some of the issues already addressed by other speakers, in particular, Eleni Gabriel, Joshua Dione, and Monty Jones, who spoke during the first day, who have eloquently articulated those issues. You may consider my contribution as a continuation of the arguments in favor of doing business unusually and for change in mindsets, not one of a redundancy. So what does this interrogating the bigger picture involve? What am I talking about? I believe that as far as Africa is concerned, the food security equation largely runs through agricultural productivity. That is, resolving the challenges of agricultural productivity can make significant strides in improving the food security situation in Africa. But I also think that our approaches towards understanding and addressing the challenges of agricultural productivity has been surrounded by a number of conditionalities, a number of ifs. If we get technology, seeds, and other inputs right, if we get the soil and water right, if we get extension and farm management right, if we get factor and product markets right, and so on. And yet available evidences conclusively suggest that these countless ifs do not hold. We did not get many of these things right. If so, one would be compelled to ask the question, why not unpack those conditions and transform the discourse from if to how to get those factors right, learning from experiences of other regions. The issue of agricultural productivity and food security is also about getting the infrastructure right and about getting the political economy right. It's also about getting the global environment right, harnessing economy-wide linkages and regional integration, capturing global opportunities, addressing climate change issues, and capacitating key actors to enhance implementation. These items inform my presentation on interrogating the bigger picture. I will start with the first, harnessing economy-wide linkages for improved agricultural performance. A good starting point to better grapple with the issues at hand would be to situate the whole agricultural productivity and food security agenda within the framework of economy-wide linkages. The reason why we need to realize agricultural productivity is not only to improve food security and achieve agricultural growth. The situation now reveals that about 52% of the total labor force in Africa is producing 20 to 30% of the GDP. A crude calculation would suggest that the ratio of productivity of the agriculture to non-agricultural labor force is in the order of less than 1 to 5. What does the future hold for Africa's agriculture? What are the alternative transformation pathways for reducing pressure on land, for increasing labor productivity, for diversifying income sources, and for achieving food security at all levels? One line of argument runs through the functionality or instrumentality of the agricultural growth for the development of non-agricultural sectors. The literature on agricultural contribution to economic growth have documented a lot of evidences on how agriculture has historically suffered from policy neglect, disinvestment, and surplus extractive practices that have undermined the performance of the sector. Compounding the food security situation, recently, the case for realizing agricultural growth in its own right, not just as an instrument of non-agricultural sector growth, has gained better recognition. In fact, the formulation of CADEP as Africa's framework and model of economic growth in Africa is built around such premises that unless Africa prioritizes and realizes its agricultural development, it can neither successfully develop and transform its overall economy nor achieve its poverty reduction and food security objectives. Somewhat missing in the discourse, however, is the impact of non-agricultural growth on agricultural productivity. For example, evidence exists indicating that African service sector and urbanization have been expanding over the last few years. What have been the impact of such expansions and growth on agricultural productivity? How can the benefit of such an expansion in other sectors be harnessed for agricultural productivity? Similarly, natural resource extraction in Africa's mineral and forest fields have recently gained momentum. How has it been affecting agricultural productivity? And how has the global food price hike been impacting agricultural productivity? Has it benefited the African food producers so as to trigger more income, more saving, and more investment in innovation to enhance agricultural productivity? If not, why not? Let's not forget that high food prices have wider implications for needed economic transformation. These are some of the bigger issues that needed to be interrogated. When it comes to harnessing regional integration to unlock Africa's production and trade potentials, it's becoming apparent that Africa has abundant potential to produce agricultural commodities, not only to feed its own population, but also to contribute towards feeding the world. Much of the available world arable land now seems to be found in Africa, even though it is very difficult to locate where this really exists. Recently, there is surge in global demand for Africa's arable land in the form of large-scale land acquisitions through land-related foreign direct investment. But Africa is a continent that contains an area of which about 70% is under arid or semi-arid environment. It's also a continent that much of it is highly vulnerable and to desertification and land degradation. You can see some of this in the maps. Africa is also a continent that has great potential in its water resources. For example, we are talking about 63 international river basins, which remains underutilized owing to an absence of water storage and irrigation infrastructure. More than 90% of Africa, the rate of irrigation is about 7%, against 40% in Asia. Harnessing this huge potential is not only the key for addressing issues of vulnerability of livelihoods and agriculture productivity, but also could provide an opportunity for forging regional cooperation and partnerships. In fact, there are a number of basin initiatives which need to be encouraged to do more for better outcomes and performance. Looking at the demand side, can continue. These are the tables showing, I don't know if it is possible. Why? Looking at the demand side, evidence suggests that there is a huge market for agricultural commodities, including food that is simply not tapped yet. For example, you have heard this over and over again. Africa is spending 50 billion US dollars annually on imports of agricultural products, and in doing so, losing huge opportunities, not just in foreign exchange, but most importantly in terms of lost jobs. Even half of that figure could transform Africa's agriculture if spent on its own products. Africa trades more with the rest of the world than within itself. The available figures indicate that it is about 7%, against 40% in Europe and 60% in North America. Intra-African trade in food, beverages, and tobacco has been about 10% in 2010. The AU Summit on Food Security, held in 2006, underscored on this pivotal point and committed to, among other things, expanding markets with particular attention to Africa's own demand and to promote intra-African trade in staple food. Joshua Dione have spoken on this. I'm not going to come back to it. A number of barriers exist, however, hampering progress to expand intra-African trade. One crucial factor that contributes toward this hampering progress is the deficient state of infrastructure in Africa in general and rural infrastructure in particular. Mount Jones and Joshua Dione have adequately highlighted this one day before yesterday. Road density in Africa is 2 times less than in Latin America and 6 times less than in Asia. Only about 1/3 of Africans living in rural areas are within 2 kilometers of an all-season road, compared with 2/3 of the population in other developing regions. Obviously, transport costs are arguably the most important impediments to intra-African trade. The average transport cost, for example, per kilometer for the Douala N'Djamena from Cameroon to Chad, distance is almost 3 times that of the USA and 2 times that of Western Europe for the same distance. And this applies to power, to water, to telephone, to internet services, and so on, which clearly undermine productivity and competitiveness of African agriculture as a whole. On the other hand, according to some estimates, an investment of 32 billion to upgrade the main intra-African road network would result in trade expansion of about $250 billion over a period of 15 years. Clearly, a regional approach is needed to harness such a potential and to make the benefits of economies of scale and improve competitiveness. Regional economic communities play a pivotal role in facilitating the implementation of regional initiatives to intra-Africa trade in agricultural commodities. AU has an initiative called PIDA, Program on Infrastructure Development in Africa, which is aimed at facilitating regional integration through improving coverage of the infrastructure network. Turning to capturing opportunities from emerging global processes. Recently, the world has seen a series of interrelated crises that affect agricultural productivity and food security in Africa. The fuel crisis had brought a new dimension to the food security equation, not only through its effects of rising costs of food production and transportation, but also reducing availability of food on world markets, as important food crops are increasingly used for biofuel production. Economic growth in some regions, particularly in Asia, have resulted in a sharp shift in consumption patterns, causing substantial increase in demand for food, also contributing towards triggering of the global high food price hikes. This signaled a strong message for regions such as Africa, which are traditionally dependent on food imports to achieve their food security. That is, having the money in hand to buy food did not guarantee access to food on the world market, a fact that motivated many to seriously consider self-reliance as an alternative course of action by engaging in captive productive processes, hence resorting to producing foods and relying on markets, which was partly the prelude to large-scale land acquisitions through foreign direct investment in Africa. As mentioned above, it is important that we understand how these processes work out and affect agricultural productivity and food security in Africa. Africa needs to enhance and benefit from trade with the rest of the world. The recent global financial crisis is expected to have a negative effect on Africa's agricultural productivity in a number of ways, exacerbating the volatility of prices of African exports, reducing official development assistance to Africa to support investment, and so on. Still, market access constraints such as standards, sanitary and phytosanitary issues, and so on remain important hurdles that Africa needs to address. Talking about climate change, Africa is a continent that is one of the most vulnerable regions with the least capacity to cope with the impacts of climate change, even though it contributes nearly nothing to the problem. Available figures indicate less than 4% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. Africa's high vulnerability arises from the natural fragility of its ecosystems, frequent natural disasters, and economic activities dependent on highly climate-sensitive natural resources and rain-fed agriculture. Is it possible to see the next picture? Yeah. This is a figure which shows some projected climate change impacts in different parts of the continent. The impacts are not necessarily the same from region to region. Extreme events of drought, floods, and sea level rise caused by climate variability and climate change constitute important variables determining agricultural productivity, food security, and livelihoods in Africa. Natural disasters triggered by extreme events, such as droughts and floods, have devastating impacts on human lives and livelihoods. They have resulted in substantial declines in productivity of economic activities and could even threaten and erode developmental gains achieved, hampering progress in achievement of development goals, including MDGs. The IPCC report predicts that up to 250 million people in Africa will experience problems in accessing sufficient water by 2020 because of climate change, and that agriculture production could be halved, could be reduced by 50% in certain instances during the same period. Agriculture productivity and food security in the African context should therefore be linked with resilience of livelihoods and adaptation of production systems to climate variability and climate change. The extent to which African agriculture successfully adapts to climate change and climate variability determines the options for successful agricultural growth and economic transformation in Africa. In African agricultural systems, which are primarily rain-fed, adaptive capacity is inherently related to the ability to maintain or to buffer ecosystem productivity under climatic stress. This requires implementing adaptation measures that reduce vulnerability and building resilience, which includes a number of issues. Most importantly, ensuring that Africa's need for climate change objectives are fully consistent with the need to boost food production and productivity. It also necessitates a judicious addressing of the historical legacies associated with the policy neglect and disinvestment in agriculture, as well as an appreciation that adaptation to climate change is an additional burden on Africa's efforts to reduce poverty and achieve development goals, because Africa did not cause the problem of climate change. Let's also not forget that Africa's weak or lack of capacity to adapt emanates from constraints regarding access to relevant climate data, quality of forecasting systems and their communication and use, as well as adaptation infrastructure, practice, and finance. It should also be noted that, I don't know if this has been raised, in climate change negotiations, and this is clear for those of you who have been following climate change negotiation process, agriculture is being negotiated within the context of mitigation. Yet, Africa's primary priority in respect of agriculture is adaptation, with mitigative functions being considered as co-benefits. You have heard what Jim Smith has been talking about during the opening. In a more strategic sense, Africa needs to grapple with the clean development imperatives and the transformation towards green economy and address the issue of agricultural productivity within this framework. It means that agriculture will simply have to become more productive while protecting ecosystems. For example, poor rural access to energy is what characterizes Africa. Access to energy, poor. What opportunities are there for expanding energy access in the framework of building a green economy? I'm turning now to the most important and, in my opinion, the tying item, which is means of implementation, factoring in and capacitating key actors. Implementation capacity has been the critical constraint in Africa, as you know. The African Union summits usually adopt important decisions on regional policies and strategies, including the 10% budget allocation to agriculture. But few of these have been implemented on the ground. Financing agricultural development has always been a fundamental problem. Commercial banks have not been providing credible solutions to the problem of rural and smallholder agriculture finance, as you know. Microfinance can play an important role, but clearly cannot be the panacea. In those few countries where increased public funds allocation to agriculture was made, you may have heard about 8 countries have reached about 10% or more, the performance of their agriculture sector has improved. Even more important is that where encouraging results have been registered, it has not happened by accident. It required conscious efforts and concerted actions by key players, government as the center. One cannot overemphasize the crucial role of a vibrant political economy as a sine qua non for change and development, without which no productivity, agricultural or otherwise, can happen on a sustainable basis. The relevant point in this case is how to capacitate the key actors, state actors, non-state actors, to enhance accountability to deliver crucial services for increased agricultural productivity and improved food security. One important hurdle often encountered in the way we usually conduct business in this respect is the tendency to continue to talk to ourselves only. Eleni has actually eloquently made a powerful case in this respect, and she has actually succeeded in disarming me of my ideas. Talking of finance for agricultural development, the people whom we present our cases have not usually been the ministers of finance or the governors of central banks who formulate credit policies. The way to help agriculture take center stage is not through continuing to talk to ourselves only. That is the convinced, ministers of agriculture included. We need to target other audiences, actors, outside of the agriculture domain as well. And these include parliamentarians. We've had experiences of parliamentarians not knowing about the 10%, the commitment made by the heads of state to allocate 10% of their budgets to agricultural sector. So we need to address parliamentarians. These are the legislators. Ministers of finance, planning, economic development, ministers of water, ministers of environment, transport, ministers of energy, education, science and technology, and so on. We need to appreciate the fact that food security is about human health first and foremost, and begin to engage people in the Ministry of Health. And we should stop whining about other sectors getting more share of the budget. If transport gets more budget, we should be happy about it, because we're talking about transport constraint as an impediment towards bringing about increased agricultural productivity. So we should look at the bigger picture. We should not confine ourselves to limited views. In conclusion, number one, there is no other sustainable and feasible option to improve food security in Africa other than raising agricultural productivity. Increasing agricultural productivity can provide an opportunity to produce surplus, which is the basis for expanding trade. Two, Africa has enormous potentials for substantial improvement in agricultural productivity, as well as for expanding trade opportunities. The challenge is how to convert these potentials into realities. As they say, people do not live on potentials. Number three, converting potentials into possibilities require harnessing of economy-wide linkages and regional integration, capturing global opportunities, addressing climate change issues, and most importantly, capacitating key actors to enhance implementation at all levels. Four, capacitating key actors to enhance implementation requires change in mindset and in how we conduct business, which may entail stopping of, as I said, whining about why other sectors such as infrastructure should receive increased investment resources. We need to look at the bigger picture. Five, the importance of having a mutual accountability framework. For example, early this week, we commemorated the African Food and Nutrition Security Day. Why are we commemorating a Food and Nutrition Security Day? We should link it with certain purposes, and I think one of the purposes should be to use it as an opportunity as a forum in which we can hold ourselves or each other accountable to our actions and the results of food and nutrition security. Mr. Chairman, if I have one more minute, I would like to share some of the initiatives of the African Union. I'll just list them. The African Union initiatives which, in my opinion, are relevant to what I have been talking about the bigger picture, and harmonizing policies and strategies on the continent. Of course, you know the CAADP framework. My colleague Martin has, I think, convinced you that CAADP is comprehensive enough. So I'm not going to talk about it. That is one of AU initiatives. We have Africa Seed and Biotechnology Program. I don't know how many of the seed and biotechnology programs are integrated within this regional initiative, regional framework. We have African fertilizer financing mechanism, and this is to enhance economies of scale at Africa level. The African Common Market for Agricultural Commodities. We have development of commodity value chains initiative. The program for infrastructure development in Africa, which I have talked about, including on water infrastructure. We have water and sanitation, and this speaks to the issue of food security. Market access, sanitary and phytosanitary issues. We have land policy initiatives, which we collaborate with the ECA and the Africa Development Bank. They have come up with a framework and guidelines for land policy in Africa. We have climate information for development program, the Clean Development Program, also a partnership program with the Africa Development Bank and the ECA. We have the disaster risk management and the Africa Risk Capacity Program, which we collaborate with the World Food Program. We have the capacitating initiative towards capacitating the non-state actors. We have the Pan-African Farmers Forum. The president, I'm very happy to see that the president of PAFO is among here, and it was a pleasure and privilege for the Africa Union Commission to have been associated with the creation of that regional forum. We have a policy framework for pastoralism, which is also trying to do something related to what we have done with the farmers' networks. We have been engaging in the with the global players for a genuine partnership and for fair play, developing common African positions on strategic issues such as climate change, such as Rio +20, sustainable development, and so on. Taking of holding each other accountable for results. There is a framework which we call the African Peer Review Mechanism, the APRM, with the NEPAD framework, which can provide an important instrument to enhance the accountability of governments in achieving the agriculture productivity and food security objectives. Taken together, these are believed to provide important frameworks to contribute towards making progress along sustainable improvement in agriculture productivity and address the challenges of food security in Africa. I thank you.